This is a very different nonprofit. It's not a foundation that the importance of which is the giving of philanthropic money. The reason they're so important is because they're in the middle of a corporation that is doing this work. And only from that position can they really make sure that what's being done is good and safe for humanity. Once they're spun out, they'll be more like any typical corporate foundation. They're giving grants out to whatever, presumably still in the scientific artificial intelligence research world. But they won't have the inside track to guide the work that's being done. And that's pretty hard to compensate. It's not a numerical amount, right? It's a position that is rare.
Today's episode is on a massive issue you might have heard mentioned, but not know many details about. That is, OpenAI deciding it wants to shed its non-profit structure permanently and become a normal for-profit company. In the process, they might give birth to one of the biggest charitable foundations to ever exist, a 100-pound gorilla focused on safe and beneficial development of AGI, with over $40 billion or $80 billion in paper assets. Or maybe the non-profit board will be messed around and not get what they're truly owed. We'll have to see. In this episode, legal expert Rose Chan Loui and I cover how this can happen and whether it's a legal loophole being used here or something more reasonable, how OpenAI, the for-profit, its staff and its investors are collectively in a direct kind of financial conflict with their nonprofit owner, why the nonprofit's control of OpenAI could actually be priceless in terms of pursuing its mission, why maybe it's nonetheless understandable for them to go and sell control anyway, how the outgunned independent members of the OpenAI nonprofit board can best play their hand to try to get the money that they deserve, the active interest shown by the California and Delaware attorneys general, which might just give the nonprofit board the support they need to get a good outcome for themselves, how you might go about valuing the nonprofit's ownership stake in OpenAI, including the flow of profits, control, and the hypothetical question of how much bidders on the open market might be willing to pay, why it's essential and neglected that the nonprofit get a big, steady stream of cash and not just equity in OpenAI that is locked up for years, how any of this can really be regarded as an arm's length transaction as required by law, this weird separate conflict between OpenAI, the for-profit, and their investor, Microsoft, and why, despite all of the questions above, Rose and I have some decent amount of optimism about how all of this is going to play out. Just so you know going in, the OpenAI nonprofit board has 9 members, including Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, 3 tech entrepreneurs, a traditional corporate leader, an economist, a military cybersecurity expert, a philanthropic foundation CEO, and 1 ML researcher. And 7 of those 9 were appointed just in the last year. This is a really exciting episode, and we've turned it around quickly while these issues are all still completely live and relevant. So without further ado, I bring you Rose Chan Loui. Today, I'm speaking with Rose Chan Loui. Rose is the founding executive director for the Lowell Milken Center on Philanthropy and Nonprofits at UCLA Law. She received her JD from NYU School of Law and spent decades practicing law with a particular focus on nonprofits and tax controversies. Earlier in the year, she weighed in on the OpenAI Foundation board situation with 2 UCLA colleagues in a paper titled Board Control of a Charity Subsidiary, the Saga of OpenAI. And that paper concluded with whatever happens in OpenAI's next chapter, protecting the charitable interests is likely to be a heroic task in the face of the overwhelming profit-making incentives. And since then, things have advanced a fair deal on the OpenAI front, with the for-profit now seemingly trying to shed the control of its non-profit owner entirely, which is going to be the topic of today's conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Rose.
Thanks so much, Rob, for inviting me on to this show and letting me talk about this topic that has been an obsession for the last few months.
I'm glad you've been obsessed with it because I'm super interested as well, and I think listeners will be too. So let's dive in. Since its founding, I think back in 2015 or 16, OpenAI has it's touted its nonprofit structure as one of the reasons it could be trusted and should be taken seriously. Its CEO Sam Altman said in 2017 that OpenAI is a nonprofit because we don't ever want to be making decisions that benefit shareholders. The only people we want to be accountable to is humanity as a whole. And that was a pretty kind of typical statement around that time, as I recall. And he even said of the nonprofit board in June last year, he famously said, "No one person should be trusted here. I don't have super voting shares. The board can fire me," and I think that's important. So its legal structure was very much not an accident or an oversight. It was pretty central, I think, to the organization's self-conception and certainly its public presentation. Can you quickly explain to us what that legal structure has been and what we think they're trying to change it into?
Sure, Rob. Yeah. So as you said, it was very carefully structured. And in the beginning, in 2014, it was 2015, it was pretty straightforward. It was founded as a scientific research organization. And the specific purpose was to provide funding for research, development, and distribution of technology related to AI. Then they also made the promise that the resulting technology will benefit the public and the corporation will seek to open source technology for the public benefit when applicable. So I just want to emphasize here that that is the legal purpose that is in the certificate of incorporation with the state of Delaware. Then in its registration with the California Attorney General, it said that its goal is to engage in research activities that advance digital intelligence in the way that is most likely to benefit humanity as a whole, unconstrained by a need to generate financial return. So just a little distinction here, that sounds more aspirational. Now, by 2019, they had been able to raise $130 million of their initial $1 billion goal. So they decided then that charitable donations were not going to be enough to achieve their charitable purpose of providing funding for research and development and distribution of technology related to AI. So they set up this structure that would accommodate and attract investors. First step was to form an LP, a limited partnership under OpenAI, which would be owned by the nonprofit, as well as employees and some early investors. That LP would be governed by the nonprofit and operated in accordance with the nonprofit's charitable purposes. The LP then created a subsidiary, right? OpenAI LLC, which you could also call the operating company. It's at this level that Microsoft invested. And interestingly, OpenAI on their website used to call Microsoft a minority owner, but they clarified on their website in December 2023 that no, it's only they only have a profits interest in OpenAI LLC. We think that is in response to inquiries by various antitrust authorities.
Yeah.
So again, operating agreement of LLC, very, like you said before, very broadcast that LLC might never make a profit and is under no obligation to do so. And one of my favorite quotes is that quote, "It would be wise to view an investment in LLC in the spirit of a donation." And just like with previous investors and the employees, there was a cap on how much they could get on their investment. And for Microsoft, we know it's 100 times of investment. They also said that that cap could be lowered with later investors. And now both the LP and the LLC are controlled by OpenAI general partner. So it and that is what we call a disregarded entity. Basically, it's just how nonprofit is controlling the for-profit entities below it. We think that there are other subsidiaries through which the newer investors have participated, but we don't have full transparency into that. But they formed a lot of other entities in Delaware, and some of them are registered in California.
So for the sake of the audience being able to picture this in their mind, the simplistic picture that I have is that currently there's a OpenAI nonprofit foundation that basically owns most of and controls an OpenAI for-profit business. And so there's the for-profit business, there's the nonprofit foundation, and those are kind of in broad strokes, those are the two entities. And
yes. Yeah, that's why, it's a lot more complicated if you draw out the whole thing. But yes, it's a nonprofit at the very top. It's the parent, which is different from a lot of corporate foundations where, a corporation makes a lot of money and then they decide we would like to do good. So they form a corporate foundation and they control entirely the corporate foundation, right? Here, the nonprofit is the genesis of this organization. And then if I could, I just thought there's 5, I think, features that were very carefully set up to protect purpose.
Sure, go for it.
So one is that, as we've said, the nonprofit has complete control of the LLC through this general partner and the nonprofit board. And then secondly, the nonprofit board is committed to the nonprofit purpose of the nonprofit, and defined publicly by OpenAI as development of AI that is AGI, that is broadly beneficial. And third, the nonprofit board was supposed to remain majority independent. But they define independent as not having any equity in OpenAI. So as other people have criticized, Sam Altman, while he didn't have equity in OpenAI, had a lot of other interests in partners.
Yeah, okay, so it's hard to say that he's independent of OpenAI in a common sense. Yeah,
in the common sense of the word. So that's why I say this is how they define it.
Yeah.
The fourth is that profit allocated to investors and employees is capped, as we've talked about. So all residual value created above those caps are to go to the nonprofit, quote, for the benefit of humanity. But it's a pretty high threshold. Then fifth, Microsoft and other investors do not participate in profits from or have any rights to IP once OpenAI has reached AGI, defined, again, broadly speaking, as artificial intelligence that is smarter than human intelligence. And the nonprofit board, under the current terms, determines when OpenAI has attained AGI. So they put a lot of things in there to protect purpose.
Yeah. So a lot of thought went into thinking about how can we get it so that, I mean, presumably they were thinking there's a lot of money here, like Microsoft might try to push us around. How are we going to ensure that the nonprofit foundation can remain true to its nonprofit purpose of building AGI that benefits all of humanity and not being corrupted by profit incentives? And so that was like clearly part of the goal. And I guess people can judge for themselves, I guess, at the end of this conversation, how well that has gone.
Correct.
What is it that they're trying to change now?
Thank you. Yes. So here we are in 2024. They make the announcement that OpenAI is going to restructure so that the nonprofit will no longer control the for-profit entities. What they're talking about, well, first of all, they had another round of funding, raised another $6.6 billion, and these new investors were able to get a deal that OpenAI would have 2 years to complete this conversion, or they would have to return the $6.6 billion of funding. The new investors are also seeking to remove the caps on investment returns, at least for them, and perhaps for old investors. Not sure where that is in negotiations.
So they previously agreed that their investment would have at most 100-fold return, and now they're trying to, they're like trying to get out of that basically, or change that, so there isn't a cap anymore.
Correct. And then, I'm not the best at math, but I thought, okay, if you have 10 billion of Microsoft, that means 100 times means a trillion.
A trillion, yeah.
A trillion, right?
So a substantial valuation.
Yes. So I don't know if there's anything comparable. So the proposed restructure, what they're saying is the nonprofit will remain, but will not be in control. And then the for-profit company will become what's called a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation, not to be confused with a California nonprofit public benefit corporation. The terms are so confusing. But basically what a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation is that while it's a for-profit, it's going to be allowed under corporate law not to 100% maximize profits. It will be allowed to take account of public good in its profit-making operations. But just to be clear, that goal is not at all the same as a legally binding commitment under tax-exempt law or state nonprofit laws. Its goal to do good is aspirational. So very, very different.
So I guess we're going from the nonprofit foundation that owns and controls the business, having an obligation to pursue its mission of benefiting humanity, to a situation where now merely they've given themselves permission to not maximize profits if they want to. They've said, wow, we might do profits and we might do some combination of other stuff, yet, TBD.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think the Delaware, I'm not an expert in that, but my understanding is you file a report every year and talk about all the good you've done. But again, it's really, I think, seen more as a public relations move.
Okay, yeah, it's not something that has a lot of teeth. I guess so. I'm going to have a fair number of sharp questions in this interview. I don't think there was anything wrong with OpenAI seeking for-profit investment in order to stay in the game and staying relevant. And I think, the idea that they had that we'll have the, investment, it's kind of capped, and then it will spill over. And at least in theory, the nonprofit foundation should be able to control, to direct the business if they think it's gone off the rails and is no longer pursuing its mission of benefiting humanity. In theory, this kind of all makes sense. I don't think that there was anything untoward, although you might think perhaps there was something a little bit naive about thinking that this would function as originally intended. But if they had just remained a nonprofit and only accepted charitable donations, I think it's fair to say that they would have become irrelevant because they just wouldn't have been able to keep up with the costs involved in training AGI or training the frontier models.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we can understand why they did what they did. And they're not at all novel in setting up a for-profit subsidiary, right? Nonprofits can do that. I think what became challenging here was first that most of the nonprofit for-profit relationships that I've seen anyway are wholly owned or mostly wholly owned. And so, you could operate a spaghetti factory, you pay tax on it because it's nothing to do with your charitable purpose. But what the net goes straight up to the parent to use for nonprofit purpose. But I think what's so different here is that the amount of external third-party investment is so huge that it becomes big. The sums are so huge and completely engulf the nonprofit.
Yeah, which is not really resourced. It's a bunch of kind of volunteer part-time board members. That's almost, I don't know whether it really has any meaningful staff to represent its own interests really seriously independent of the business. And that's a major weakness, I guess, with the structure that was set up. Right.
Yeah, I mean, they only show from their 2022 year about 19 million in assets at the nonprofit level. And here you have a subsidiary that it just keeps going up. But latest number is $156 billion of valuation. And so it becomes very hard. It definitely looks like the tail is definitely wagging. Yeah. So
at this point, as OpenAI, the nonprofit and the business is kind of considering making this transition, what are the legal obligations the individuals on the OpenAI Foundation's board are bound to? Is it to maximize the achievement of the foundation's mission, or something less than that?
No, the board is still bound by the original purpose. That they've not changed it so far. I'm assuming there might be some tweaking of that nonprofit statement of purpose in all of this. What's interesting, though, Rob, is that when you focus on how they wrote it in the Delaware certificate, it is to provide funding for research and development. So going back to, the founding of the for-profit subsidiary, like you said, they would probably have become irrelevant because it costs so much to do this R&D. And so I think they were still complying with it. The question is, at what point do the for-profit interests of all the investors, the private parties, take over, and as such that the nonprofit goal has been subsumed? Their legal obligation hasn't changed, at least not yet.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think there's roughly eight members on the foundation board, and I guess they're in a tricky spot because they're like entering this negotiation with this business that wants to become independent, to escape their control, to be freed of their control. Of course, the CEO of the business is also on the board, is one of the members. They're very rich and powerful and known for being willing to be fairly aggressive when his interests are challenged. And they're also up against, I guess, compared to the business, and I suppose compared to the investors, they're very under-resourced, I think, in terms of their staffing. So they're basically a bunch of volunteers who have stepped up to take this role. I don't know whether they're paid very much for this. Certainly, they're not paid to be doing anything like full-time work. And they're up against these other organizations where, like, in each dollar, they manage to squeeze out of this negotiation that they get rather than the nonprofit. It's just like pure gain for them, right? If OpenAI doesn't have to compensate the foundation another $1 billion. That's another $1 billion that the investors and the staff and so on can keep for themselves.
Right.
So
now,
yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think since we wrote our article, I think what's encouraging is that, at the end of our article, we said, well, we hope someone's going to look into this. But it does look like even Delaware has written them and said, we need to review this conversion. And OpenAI says they're going to cooperate. So just, again, this might be a little technical, but Delaware governs kind of the governance aspects of OpenAI nonprofit. And then, but California, where OpenAI is based and has its assets, is interested in making sure that the charitable assets remain protected. And the Attorney General of California, we hear that they also are looking at this and that OpenAI is in conversations with the Attorney General. So at least that's going on.
Yeah. So I was going to say they've got a tough task ahead of themselves standing up for the interests of the foundation, but I guess they are getting a little bit of assistance in the pressure that might come from the Delaware Attorney General and the California Attorney General. And I think the IRS has an interest here as well, the kind of U.S. tax organization.
The IRS does have an interest, but I don't know what we've lost as a tax, because they've not really had any profits yet, as far as we know. So the for-profit, as far as we know, again, we don't get to see their tax returns. But based on how much that they are spending in order to do their R&D, they might not really have owed tax even if they were taxed. And whether they're taxed or not depends on whether the operations, the activities of the for-profit are considered unrelated business income or still related to that original scientific research purpose, whether it's still charitable. And, when does it become research and change into more commercial? I would think ChatGPT was probably some kind of marker there because that looks very commercial now to me. Yes, I think it's becoming more and more business.
So in planning for this, I was trying to get kind of conceptual clarity on what's going on with this conversion. And I found it useful to think about kind of who would be wronged, what would have gone wrong if OpenAI just became a for-profit overnight with kind of in exchange for nothing. It didn't actually provide any compensation to the nonprofit foundation. And I think the reason that would be kind of legally and morally unacceptable is that it's made kind of all of these promises and commitments as part of being a nonprofit since it started. And it can't just kind of promise all of these things and then take them back once things start going well on the business side. Sometimes those were kind of implicit promises, and other times, as we've mentioned, they were kind of really explicit because it very much wasn't an oversight. It was very carefully thought out how this was going to be. And I think some of those commitments include, I guess, to society and to the tax system, it's kind of promised that the foundation's equity stake in the project, which is currently in the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars maybe, it all has to go to this mission of building artificial general intelligence that is safe and benefits all of humanity. That's what it was constituted to do. I think it's really important not to miss is that lots of staff joined and contributed to its success and its accumulation of key research breakthroughs and intellectual property over the years. And they were kind of promised that it would be guided by this goal of building safe AGI that benefits humanity with this non-profit structure rather than just being guided by the profit motive. And I think many of these people, many of these fantastic scientists would have been unwilling to join and would have gone and taken their talents elsewhere if it had just been a for-profit company trying to maximize its revenue, because that's not something that many of these people would have wanted to help with. And so it then would have not ended up being the key player that it is. I guess a more minor point perhaps is that donors like Elon Musk, who I think gave or committed $100 million or something in the very early days, I guess, they gave to the nonprofit. I don't think Elon, if it was a for-profit entity, I don't think he would have donated the $100 million. And I think there are a few other groups that they gave smaller amounts of money. Maybe that's a little bit by the by, given that it's small in the scheme of all of the investment that they've received by this point, but still notable. And
it's still a huge amount of contributions, right?
I suppose on the human scale, $100 million is a lot of money.
Yes.
Yeah. An interesting thing that is possible to miss, and I'm just going to double check that this is true after we finish the recording, is that I think early on when it was just a nonprofit, they were able to sponsor foreign visas. They didn't have this thing, the H-1B visa cap, which allowed them to bring in, I think, in principle, like a lot more foreign staff to come and work at what was kind of then thought of as a nonprofit rather than a business. So that could have been a meaningful boost early on. I'm not sure how important it was actually in the scheme of things. And I guess another smaller thing, though I think it matters, is that they kind of, by purporting to be a nonprofit that's motivated by the benefit of all of humanity, I think that's part of how they bought goodwill from a lot of different parties and got a lot of people to be on board and generally supportive, and maybe got a lower level of regulatory scrutiny and got more trust from the government, in all of these hearings. And so I think society and a lot of different parties would stand cheated if the nonprofit foundation were not fully compensated so that it could pursue its mandate to the greatest extent possible, basically. Yeah, have I got that? Have I got that all right?
Yeah, no, I think you absolutely have. I think the action here is at the state level, because even though it has its tax exemption at the nonprofit parent level, I don't think they've the nonprofit hasn't been distributed anything yet, right? Anything of significance. And then, like I said, even the for-profit subsidiary seems to not have any net profits. Again, we have no transparency into their tax returns, but they have made all kinds of representations to the public and to both Delaware and California. So it's still a promise, it's still a commitment, and I think that's why the action is going to be with the attorneys general. Yeah.
So I think, to be clear, nobody is actually arguing that the nonprofit foundation doesn't deserve compensation. I was just wanting to elaborate on all of the reasons why, so that people appreciate the force, like the strength of the reasons.
Yes,
which is quite
absolutely. I mean, it's all over their website still, right? Yeah. But I think the most complicated part of this is how to compensate the nonprofit fairly. And one of the issues, well, first, what things need to be valued? It seems like they own IP. They have a right to IP. And then I think they own control right now. So generally when you have these transactions, there's a premium when you have a controlling interest, right? So how much is that valued? Their interest in profits is kind of difficult for me to figure out how to assess, because like we said, they need to be over $1 trillion before they even get supposedly a profits interest, even though they own it. The way that the deals are structured with Microsoft and other private investors is that it doesn't go to OpenAI nonprofit until the investors have recovered their investments and up to 100 times their investments. So does that mean they own nothing, or does that mean they should be compensated for giving up their interest in the residual value? Because they have said that they think they will make like gobs more than that. And so, while it sounds like a high threshold, they're expecting the nonprofit, or at least that they used to say that. So that, to me, I don't know how to value that.
So we'll come back to the valuation in a minute, because it's quite a can of worms, and we can explain to people like just how difficult it is to make sense of what the dollar what the dollar figure should be. But is this move? I haven't heard of another a nonprofit owning a business wanting to do this switch before. Is this a really innovative thing, or is there kind of a track record of nonprofit foundations making this kind of conversion already?
There's kind of a parallel history with health organizations that went from being nonprofit to for-profit. And Jill Horowitz, who is our faculty director, is an expert on all that. So there is that example, and she does caution us that a couple of these where they thought that and the private foundations that resulted are quite large, but in retrospect they should have been compensated a lot more than they were compensated. So that's probably our best example right now. But theoretically, potentially here, this could be the largest nonprofit there is, at least U.S. based. It seems like there's a very, very large one of over 100 billion based out of Denmark.
Okay, yeah. There's the
right?
Novorsk. I think it's the group that made Monjaro and the GLP-1 inhibitors, the weight loss drugs. They have an enormous foundation.
They did that too?
I believe that's it, yeah.
Yeah, so they're huge. And then there's one in India, but certainly in the United States, I think our biggest one in terms of endowment is Gates, and they're about 50 billion. So anyway, now I'm jumping again into valuation, so I will stop.
Yeah. So just before we get to the valuation, I wanted to take a second to consider: is there any amount of compensation, any sort of equity stake, or any kind of amount of money that can really make the nonprofit foundation truly whole for giving up its strategic control of the organization OpenAI in terms of pursuing its mission? And I think that the case against that is that OpenAI is one of the groups most likely to develop AGI. That the whole thing, this foundation, is set up to make it go well. So by having a controlling stake in OpenAI, that the nonprofit board gets, maybe a 20% chance or something of staffing up, insisting on being in the room where all the decisions are being made, the room where it happens, and literally directing the major decisions about how this transition to an AGI-dominated world takes place, or at least operating within the worldview of OpenAI, that this is going to happen and this is how they could influence things. So this is of enormous value to the pursuit of the organization's goal, perhaps kind of a priceless one. Now, it's true that you could take some money and make grants to try to influence the development of AGI in a positive direction, but it's kind of unclear that even trying to make hundreds of billions of dollars in grants, that it would buy you as much ability to actually steer the direction of things in the way you want, as if you just actually retain control of the organization that matters. Because foundations have tried to do, there have been various foundations that have tried to influence this sort of thing, but they tend to find it hard to give away more than some number of low billions of dollars, and even that takes years and is very difficult. And then they're not confident about the marginal grants that they're making, because there just isn't necessarily the ability to absorb that kind of capital on truly useful projects outside of the businesses that are doing the work. It's hard to do this kind of stuff outside of the organizations that actually matter, which is the organization that they control now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because the core of the purpose was not about making money. It was to raise money, but specifically so that they could guard against bad AI, right? So how do you compensate for that? No, I think you're right. I think the question really comes down to the facts as they are, which is that they've invited in so much external investment. Can it go on this way? I mean, I think originally when it was structured, they were very careful to not have too much private benefit, but there's an awful lot of private benefit going on right now, or at least it looks like that.
Does the nonprofit foundation, does it ever have to demonstrate that it is better to sell OpenAI, that's the best way to pursue its mission? Does it ever have to prove that to anyone?
Well, I think that's part of the analysis the nonprofit board has to do right now, is can they make the argument that this current structure, as carefully structured as it was, is not sustainable, and that the best thing that the nonprofit can do is just become independent, maybe, because is it actually I'm not sure they can act all that independently right now, or that they are in fact acting all that. I think they may try, but it's really hard when you have $157 billion, on you,
set against you,
set against you, and you have only like the 19 million sitting in your bank account. They do have good counsel, I can tell you that, and they have. I'm not sure who the investment banks are representing. It seems like they're representing
Goldman Sachs
more
might represent them.
Right, but they're representing OpenAI, right, as a whole, not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
I think because it's more about OpenAI versus Microsoft.
I see.
I can't remember who's representing who. I think they have Goldman and then Microsoft has Morgan Stanley.
Okay,
Is that right?
So that's bad news, I guess, because what you really want, I think, is the nonprofit foundation to have its own totally independent legal counsel and business analysts who are representing not the interests of the business and not the interests of Microsoft, certainly.
They do have separate legal counsel.
Okay.
But I think it'd be nice if they also have their own, and maybe they do, but it's not been their own valuation people. It's super complicated. Again, we keep ending up there. Right. We're trying to forestall that discussion. That is what we're going to talk about next. I suppose. Yeah. I do think that everyone on the board, I imagine, wants to do their job. They want to benefit the foundation. I see no reason to think that
at least, the 7 members who've been added recently, Larry Summers and various others, that they're acting in bad faith in any way. It's just that the deck is kind of stacked a little bit against them. It's going to take a lot of effort on their part to stick up for this organization, given the intense attention that is going to be put onto trying to drive down the valuation and get them to sell, even if maybe it's not in the interests of the foundation's mission in reality.
Right. And then, I don't know if this is jumping ahead also, Rob, but the other thing I keep coming back to is, what kind of cash do they even have, right? Because one advantage would be, okay, just give us a lot of money and we'll go our merry way and I don't know what, become a watchdog organization. And then, but like you said, I think the difference was that they weren't just giving out, they were giving out grants, but that's not where they were having the most impact or where they're likely to have the most impact. I completely agree that I don't know how you compensate for that.
So if I was on the board, I think, it would be very understandable to think, well, maybe in theory, in a different timeline, we could have maintained real control of OpenAI, the business. But in reality, as things have panned out, the board isn't really empowered to truly direct the operations of the business because there's just too many strong forces set against it. So maybe the best thing that we can do under this circumstance is to give up our stake in exchange for cash and then use that cash whatever way we think is best, operating independently of the business as a sort of new entity that can pursue the mission of positive AGI using grants or whatever else. It's definitely an understandable take.
Or maybe some combination of cash and equity so that you have money to do your work on a present basis and then still keep an interest in this future potential immense value.
Yeah. So we'll come back to the cash and equity thing because I think that's a sleeper issue that I've heard almost nobody talk about that actually could be absolutely central. It could be almost as important as all of the other things that we're discussing. So I definitely want to bring that to people's attention. But yeah, let's turn to this valuation question. How does one figure out a fair valuation for the foundation's control and equity stake or profit stake in OpenAI, the business?
Yeah. Again, I'm not an expert in this. I mean, I think the investment bankers have to figure out. What I'm hearing is a number of 37 billion at the low end to compensate them for their interest in the intellectual property. And then a high of, if you take 157 billion, divide by 2, $80 billion. And I mean, I don't think we're at 157. That's definitely because there's definitely other interests to out there that have their stake. But I think it's more components, right? What are the components?
So we can break down the components. So as you were saying earlier, it's a little bit difficult to visualize in audio, but basically, so there's all of these other groups, including Microsoft and others, that have invested in the business, and they get all of the profits up to some point. And of course, the staff also have lots of equity. So they own a bunch of the profits, basically the early profits that the organization would get. So there's all of these different other interest groups that kind of get paid first, up to some level beyond which they don't get paid anymore. And then it might be at a valuation of $1 trillion. I guess I've heard different estimates. We really don't know the breakdown. I've heard someone say 200 billion, other people say 1 trillion. But it's beyond some threshold like that pays off all of the staff that have put into it, all of the businesses that have invested in it. After that, the nonprofit gets all of the profit, I think, basically. Now they own 100% after that stage.
That stage.
How do you figure out how much that is worth? So hard, because it depends on, you have to literally estimate what's the probability that OpenAI at some point makes more than $200 billion in net present value of profits, or more than, or whatever it is, more than $1 trillion of net present value of profits. And then you have to think, and how much more is it going to be? And I guess, and what timeline would it be? How much do we have to discount it? That's probably not the main issue. But the question is what's the probability that it be that it's more than $1 trillion in profits? And how much more? Is it going to be 10 trillion, 100 trillion? Because they have visions of, changing everything.
Correct. And so that's why I think that's the hardest part, because a trillion is if Microsoft gets its 100 times and they invest 10, but they've already invested more than that. And then that's not counting anybody else's interest. So it's more than $1 trillion before they get, if Microsoft actually gets its deal, right, for its previous investments.
Don't they get wiped out if the nonprofit board decides they've achieved AGI? Or is it that they lose something if that's the case, right?
Yes. So that's the other question is, no one really agrees on AGI. I mean, they have this definition, but whether it has surpassed human intelligence is anyone's guess. And which kind of gets back to your point, Rob. If they're not in control anymore, they have even less transparency into that. So, and Sam Altman has said kind of recently that he thinks AGI may be a moving target. So, all of the incentive is to keep moving that point to the future. I mean, certainly on the part of Microsoft, we've not reached AGI yet.
So as I understand it, Microsoft will want to say we haven't achieved AGI.
Correct.
So that they can kind of keep their access and their... Because I can't remember exactly what the agreement is. Maybe you didn't know exactly either, but it's something like they lose access to the IP.
Yes, they don't have any more rights to the IP after OpenAI has reached AGI.
So it's in Microsoft's interest to always say that they haven't developed AGI, and
right.
and I think in OpenAI's interest to say that they have even before they have. And it's so vague that who even knows, right?
Yeah, certainly the nonprofit's interest is to say yes, you have, and because then all the other stuff is out the window, right? Then all of that belongs to the nonprofit.
Okay, so we've got this kind of cascading profit thing, which is difficult to value.
Based on a nebulous goal, based on this nebulous, concept.
So I think it is kind of the case that OpenAI probably either it fizzles out and doesn't make that much money, and the foundation probably would in fact receive basically nothing, very, very little in profits, or it does become one of the most important business of all time, probably the most important business of all time, in which case its valuation indeed definitely could be in the trillions, could be in the tens of trillions. It's definitely not unimaginable if we see the kind of economic growth that in the OpenAI worldview we're expecting over coming decades or centuries. So, but because so much of the profit is concentrated in this minority of blowout, incredible profit scenarios, that suggests that's good for the nonprofit's valuation. That's good for the nonprofit's foundation's valuation, because if OpenAI was guaranteed to have a mediocre outcome, like it had 100% probability of making $200 billion, then the foundation would be guaranteed to receive basically nothing. But if you say, well, it's got a 99% chance of nothing, but a 1% chance of $100 trillion, then the nonprofit foundation is basically worth $1 trillion. So the fact that the outcomes are so high variance is definitely to the benefit of the nonprofit foundation.
Well, and I guess if I were the nonprofit and arguing on their behalf, I would say, but look at all these investors who are coming in now.
Oh, yeah.
And
they believe.
Right? They believe that this is like it's a high reward investment for them, and they don't think that they think that cap is real because they want to remove it.
Oh yeah. So they must believe that we're going to receive a bunch of money. Otherwise, they wouldn't be trying to get rid of us.
If they thought that was enough. They wouldn't bother to argue about it. So that's kind of interesting. We think it's a huge hurdle, but they're all thinking, no, we want that removed. We don't want to be limited to 100 times. So
this is kind of the valuation of on the business side of the future stream of profits that is hoped for. It's a weird circumstance, but a somewhat familiar circumstance. Another aspect that's a bit weirder still is the fact that the nonprofit foundation has this, in principle, control of this potentially historical organization. And that is something that they really value because it allows them, or they should value because it allows them to pursue their mission. It's also something that other organizations, I think, if it were up for auction, would really value an awful lot as well. If actual control of OpenAI as a business was put up for auction, it wouldn't. I mean, all of the governments of the world could bid on it, and all of the businesses, Microsoft could bid on it, Google could bid on it. They would value this enormously, and so that, and we know that whenever the controlling stake in any business usually gets a big premium, 20 or 40%. In this case, I could imagine it being a lot more, given how important people think the decision. Like, this is more important than a furniture company or something like that.
Right. Yeah. The number I've heard is also 40%. So, and I assume that's 40% of like the cost of the value of a share, right? Like, so you add another 20 to 40%. So, but even then, so is their share, I mean, ownership wise, it's 100%, but profits interest wise, it's definitely not that. It's under 50, it's 50-ish.
Yeah.
Right.
So does the nonprofit foundation have to insist on getting extra compensation for giving up its control of OpenAI?
My understanding is Nonprofits Council agrees that there should be a control premium paid to the nonprofit. So they're not disagreeing at all in concept, and they do think I think they're doing what they can to get that fair compensation, including control premium. But what that is, how to value it is kind of, so I think people agree conceptually on the nonprofit side, including their council. So that is actually encouraging also.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Suggest they're not being pushovers. they're getting good legal advice or decent legal advice. But how do you value it? I mean, I was thinking about it in terms of putting it up for auction and saying, well, what could we get on the open market for this? That would be one way of conceptually trying to think, how much is this worth it? But it sounds like that's maybe not the standard way of doing it.
When you say that, like that would be for-profit companies, that they would just say who would like to buy this or buy the intro, because it's not for sale, right? So it would kind of be a hypothetical.
So, but isn't it the case that in theory they could say, well, we're going to sell our control of the organization to Google, or we're going to sell it to the US government, or we're going to sell it to UAE, or we're going to sell it to the highest bidder, basically, whoever's willing to give us the most cash in exchange for
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, that's an interesting exercise.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not Microsoft and the others would let that happen, that's a whole other, because I think Microsoft they would not love it. Yeah. But that is an interesting thing to see, because there are definitely investors coming around. Yeah, I mean, actually, that leads to the question of who is going to end up. Is anyone going to end up with a controlling interest after the nonprofit is spun out?
Yeah, because it seems like you're saying ownership might be sufficiently distributed that there'll be no one entity that has the 50% threshold to control it. Yeah.
I mean, Microsoft has a big head start. At least in terms of profits interest. Yeah.
I mean, you definitely could ask, if we, the nonprofit foundation, went to Microsoft and we negotiated really hard to sell control of OpenAI for the most amount of money that we could get, you'd at least think that they should try to get that amount of money, that sort of compensation would be due. But I guess you're saying because nobody might end up with control, maybe that's like the wrong hypothetical to be imagining, because instead you're distributing the stakes among many different actors, and nobody will be able to. No one person will have, or no one institution will have the 50% threshold.
So the other thing I've been wondering is whether the shares, the equity that the nonprofit gets out of this will be voting or non-voting, or some combination, right? We know it's not going to be majority voting, because that would give them control. But should the nonprofit board insist that they have some voting shares, so that they're still in the room,
so they can still speak up,
so
or
they can
be
still
somewhat
speak
informed.
up, right? Even if they don't drive it, that they can still speak up on behalf of that original purpose. Because could there be some point where the for-profit becomes so profit-driven that ethically, if the nonprofit sticks with its original purpose of protecting development of AI, that it's just not something they want to be involved in.
Yeah, I
despite the potential for a lot of profit. It's sort of the same thing,
right.
but like when the universities are asked to divest.
They might need to divest. Right,
Would they need to divest of their own baby because it's gone so far astray?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the nonprofit foundation should, I guess, put some value on its ability to monitor what the business that it birthed is doing, which I guess calls for maintaining at least some small number of voting shares.
Some number of voting shares.
So we've heard this number of $37.5 billion in equity get thrown around. I guess the nonprofit board, we probably think it should try to bid that up. If they should do its best to bid that up on the basis of, well, we're giving up control, that's of enormous value. Also, maybe that's undervaluing the prospects of OpenAI as a business, that it has some chance of being this enormously valuable thing. And look at how much all these other businesses are bidding. Look how desperate they are to get control and to get rid of this cap. But I guess even if it's kind of 40 billion at the lower level, that would make them one of the biggest foundations, biggest charitable foundations around. And I guess if they could bid it up to more like 80 billion, which is a number that I've heard is like perhaps a more fair amount, all things considered, then I think they would be. You're saying they would be one of the biggest in the world, really.
Yes. And perhaps also most fair because, like you have pointed out, they're probably not going to get cash in that amount, right? Because they're so cash strapped, which is like, it's interesting they have this crazy, gigantic valuation, but they're so cash strapped. That's why they keep having to fundraise. So I think, just realistically speaking, it's going to be hard for the nonprofit to get that much in cash. They just, right? So what's the best then? It seems like the best is to get some combination, or maybe since they haven't had any distributions, but maybe part of the deal is that they have to distribute cash in some amount every year. But going back to your point, they are giving up a lot that really can't be paid for. They no longer get to drive. They no longer get to say that the for-profit entities will follow charitable purpose of developing AGI and AI safely for the benefit of humanity.
And that's a huge sacrifice to their mission.
That is a big sacrifice of mission. Nonprofit board would just have to get there by saying we just don't have the ability to force that now with so many external investors, I guess.
So there's two blades to the scissors here. One is, how much would other groups be willing to pay in order to get this stuff from us? What's the market value of it? And then there's the other side, which is, what would we be willing to sell it for? Which is like, how much do we value it as the nonprofit foundation? And it's like kind of unclear that any amount is worth it. Or I don't know, any amount that they're likely to get. But they certainly shouldn't be selling it for less than what they think is sufficient to make up for everything that they're giving up in terms of pursuit of their mission. So they might think, well, $40 billion, it actually just isn't enough. If that's all that we're being offered, then we should actually just retain control. So that's another hurdle that you have to pass, is arguing that it's a sufficient amount to actually be a good decision.
I guess the flip side of that, trying to think, sitting in their chairs, is that they also then, because their purpose is to develop AGI, right? And so if you don't get the additional investment, you can't actually develop AGI. At least that's what they're saying.
I see. So you got to argue it down saying, well, if it's controlled by the nonprofit foundation, then this company actually isn't worth that much. It's only worth that much if it can break free. And then I suppose, which one is the nonprofit foundation owed? Is it the amount that it's valued at if they control it, or if they don't? I think the latter.
Yeah, that they can't achieve purpose without the additional investment. I mean, that's the whole reason they established the for-profit subsidiary in the first place. And the need for funding just doesn't seem to go away. But I think what's so tricky is how does the public know when AGI has been developed? Who's going to tell us that? Who's going to tell us that when all of the for-profit incentive is to say it's not there yet?
Yeah. Is there anything more to say on the dollar valuation aspect?
Just that, to remember that we do have the attorneys general involved now. And so there is someone, I think, speaking up for the nonprofit other than the nonprofit itself.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think, Rob, what if there are competing interests on the part of the two states. I mean, I think they're going to want OpenAI to stay in California, because if it should hit starts making money, then that's a good thing.
They'd like to tax it.
They'd like to tax it. But at the same time, I think at least California is very protective of charitable assets. So I think in the present that we'll have that assistance with getting a fair deal for the nonprofit here.
Should we talk about this cash versus equity issue? Maybe we should explain to people why I think this is so central.
Yeah, go.
And that's because, so you could imagine that they sell OpenAI and all they get is equity. So that is to say, they get shares basically in the future profits of the organization. But very often in these situations when you don't have, like the company is not yet mature, it's not yet publicly traded, those shares can't be sold. You have to continue to hold them, or you're only allowed to sell them at this very incremental rate until such time as the business decides that now we're a mature business, now we're going public, everyone can kind of sell their shares as they wish. So if that is how things go and the nonprofit foundation only receives equity, it doesn't have almost any cash on hand, then it's not going to be able to make any grants now. It's not going to be able to actually deploy the hypothetical resources that it has in the valuation to accomplish its mission, which is to guide the development of AGI in a positive direction. But now is the critical time to be deploying resources to make that happen. If you wait until such time as OpenAI is already a mature business, it's already making all of the profits, it's already publicly traded, we're already in the AGI world, probably by that stage. The technology has matured. It's probably pretty clear what it looks like. There's not so much room to guide it. And the amount of interest will have increased enormously, such that anything the foundation might hope to do is kind of going to be a drop in the bucket. So now is the crucial time to be funding governance work. Now is the crucial time to be funding technical AI safety work that might be relevant. And I mean that's the view of almost everyone who's actually trying to pursue those missions seriously. So they have to get cash soon in order to. It would be totally irresponsible to only take equity and lock it up for decades. That would be completely inconsistent with their mission, to the point where it would almost seem negligent to me. I don't know whether legally it's negligent, but anyway, I think this is one way that they could end up getting screwed and not being able to actually do what they're meant to do. That wouldn't be immediately obvious. It wouldn't. The fact that people could say, "Oh, but they got this huge amount of money," and you're like, "Yeah, but they can't do anything with it for 10 years. So what really is the point?"
Right. It's like getting a bequest and you're sitting around waiting for the person to die.
Yeah, right.
But that's why I think it probably will have to be hopefully some combination of cash and equity. But I think the equity, while not controlling, I would say that I would ask for some amount of it to be voting so that you have a real voice, even if you're not controlling. But, you make such a good point that I hadn't really thought about in terms of, can they have impact independently? So on one hand, they could just really be independent, so the nonprofit board really could protect purpose and safe development of AGI. But you have made the point that there's all these other organizations out there doing that, and they don't have, you think, at least in your view, don't have the same impact as OpenAI nonprofit could by being inside the hen house. I mean, like being right yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people might have different views on that. So to be clear, I'm not saying that the grants that they have made have been bad or haven't been effective. But the question is, given that there's already a lot of philanthropic interest in this area, does extra money make that much difference above and beyond the billions that are already being deployed in this area? And that's the thing where it's hard to, you can't just deploy $100 billion or $10 billion all at once. These sectors like AI governance can only grow at a particular sort of pace, and there's lots of work that can kind of only happen within the government itself. It can't happen in nonprofits that are funded through grants. So there's a lot of limitations. People imagine that being a nonprofit foundation is just this fantastic position, and in some sense it is, but you also struggle to actually accomplish your mission. It's not trivial to get the right people matched up with the projects and to grow everything really quickly.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think where you're having me conclude now is that this is a very different nonprofit. It's not a foundation that the importance of which is the giving of philanthropic money out for. I mean, they do that, but really, the reason they're so important is because they're in the middle of a corporation that is doing this work. And only from that position can they really make sure that what's being done is good and safe for humanity. Once they're spun out, they'll be more like any typical corporate foundation. They're giving grants out to whatever, presumably still in the scientific artificial intelligence research world. But they won't have, and when I say control, not just like the voting, but they won't have the inside track to guide the work that's being done.
Yeah.
And that's pretty hard to compensate. It's not a numerical amount, right? it's a position that is rare.
So I'm not sure that they should not sell it. I'm not sure that actually is worth. But I think you could make a strong case. And I think if I was kind of representing the nonprofit foundation's interests as legal counsel or as a valuation person, I would be making all these arguments that it's of almost irreplaceable value. And so we need an enormous amount of compensation in order to be willing to give up what is this plum position in the ecosystem, and pointing out how difficult it is for the foundation to accomplish its mission just by making grants. Certainly, if the money is locked up in equity, well, what use is that to our mission? So you got to give us something better. That's what you would do in a tough negotiation if you were really backing that group's corner. And I hope they kind of get the advice that they need to do so.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, Rob. I was looking at it very much more from dollars and cents and how do you get that, but there is a part of it that is irreplaceable.
Yeah. I mean, at what point, let's say hypothetically that the valuation was super low, that somehow they got talked down to some ridiculous amount, like only $10 billion. Like, that would kind of be negligent on their part. Perhaps it would be an accident, but you would think, like how could that get challenged? I suppose you're saying the attorney generals in California or Delaware could say, this is crazy, this is inappropriate. Would anyone else have standing to object or to say this foundation is corrupted or it's not doing its job?
So I think a couple things. Elon Musk is illustrating one. He's a previous donor, and is saying that misrepresentations were made, and so he has standing to bring suit. They also can. The attorneys general could start what's called a special interest lawsuit or something like that, where they could appoint, like let's say they just don't want to bring the litigation. They could appoint, like let's say one of these AI research organizations that really cares about this to bring a suit on their behalf. So it's rare, but that could be done. And there's a couple examples, one involving, for example, the ones I know of that Jill has cited. There's a case in Hawaii where the attorney general was actually on one side and the neighbors were on the opposite side, and the courts allowed the neighborhood collective to bring suit to defend a trust that and not allow a food concession to be on this property. So if there is a group with a special interest in it, but not a direct economic interest, the AG could do that. But I don't know. I don't know if that. I mean, I think if California really didn't think, I think they'd probably step in. But yeah. I think that I think the best result here, at least speaking as a former practitioner, is that they reach a deal that the AG can support and that they think protects public's interest in it. But you would have to get over that hurdle that the current structure and kind of the influence of third-party investors makes the nonprofit board's position untenable in the long term. I think you just have to say reality is that ... They can't continue to do this in this structure, no matter how they tried to do this nonprofit for profit.
So you're saying part of the argument would be the current structure in practice isn't allowing the nonprofit foundation to pursue its mission because it's just outgunned. And
it needs the money.
It needs the money. Oh, I see. It needs the cash. It needs the money in order to be able to. Okay. I mean, there's a little bit of an irony here because, of course,
yes.
they could give up 1% and then get a whole lot of cash for that, and then use that to skill up and staff up, and then they could try to back their corner. But I suppose the challenge is that OpenAI, the business, doesn't want that to happen. And the investors don't really want that to happen. They don't want to see the nonprofit foundation with control and empowered and with lots of its own independent staff having its own thoughts and imposing itself.
I think it was one thing when it was vague what kind of profits OpenAI was going to make, and it was a startup. And now that they see, and now they're so connected with Microsoft, for example, just operationally. So if your investors are in essence revolting and they were like, we won't put any more in unless the nonprofit control goes away, then from that perspective, the nonprofit can't continue to pursue its charitable purpose.
I see. Okay. So the argument would be not that it would be impossible in principle for the nonprofit foundation to insert itself and to be more assertive and to pursue its mission, but rather that it's got itself into this tangle where it's now so dependent on Microsoft, it's now so dependent on all of these other interests that hate it and want to get rid of it, that it's now made itself too vulnerable, and now it has to accept this kind of exit strategy that saves some ability to pursue its mission, even if ideally it could have gone down a different path 5 years ago.
Right.
And that's what they'll say to the California Attorney General?
That I don't have ears on. I mean, not yet, not now. But that's probably, I imagine, like an answer to your question, that's what they would say, that we can't, it was like that when they formed the for-profit, but the for-profit and the investors were willing to agree to all those terms at the beginning. But if they're not willing to agree to those terms anymore, and they won't put in any money otherwise, unless those terms are lifted, then where do they go?
Okay, and the idea is, well, the business might just fall apart because it needs a constant infusion of cash, it needs a constant infusion of investment.
Or they'll be beat to the finish line.
Punch. I see. Anthropic or Google.
Right. We haven't really talked about that, right? They've done a lot, but they're not the only ones in this game.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I can kind of see that case. It does rely on OpenAI, the business, not being able to get investment from elsewhere to continue fueling its work and fueling its growth, which I guess there's a lot of question marks about how true that really is. Like, could they really not get any investment from someone else? Like, would not SoftBank or some other group be willing to put in money at the 100x return multiple? I mean, maybe not Microsoft, because Microsoft wants to stand its ground and wants to get rid of the nonprofit foundation, but other groups might be willing to stump up some investment.
That's interesting. Maybe you go outside of that network of tech companies and go to financial or whatever.
So that's the kind of thing that I guess the California Attorney General might want to come back with and probe how true is this argument really?
Yes, maybe we'll have given them some other questions that they can ask.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, if you're listening in, yeah. Another puzzle for me is, as I understand it legally, this sale has to happen at arm's length, which is obviously. All of these groups are kind of entangled with one another. You've got the business, you've got the nonprofit, you've got the investors, and so on. But the nonprofit foundation has to, the sale of this one part of this broad entity to the other part of the entity has to happen in such a way that the interests of the nonprofit foundation aren't corrupted. And I guess the legal term for that is it has to happen at arm's length. It has to be sort of independent in some way. Is that right?
Yes, because you're supposed to determine, that's how you're supposed to determine your fair market value and all that, it should be an arm's length negotiation. So, I mean, I think going back to the point that should mean that the nonprofit has its own counsel. And I would say, hopefully they also have their own valuation expert, because OpenAI, in some ways it's the same, but in other ways it's not. Their interests are not completely aligned with the for-profit, right?
So the thing that it just seems so hard for this to be an arm's length transaction in reality, right? Because the CEO of the business who's pursuing this is on the board. I guess maybe he might have to recuse himself from the vote, but surely he's part of the discussions. You would imagine that it's the business that is proposing this thing.
Well, he's definitely not, because now he wants equity.
Okay, I see. So he can't vote? Is that the idea?
Well, I just mean his interests are at odds also, right?
Completely at odds, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even more now, because
sense.
In the past he could say that he didn't have equity, and so he wasn't making money from the for-profit, at least not directly. And so he had no conflict with the nonprofit's purpose and activities. But now, again, he becomes one of the other people wanting money out of this.
He's like another investor.
He's like another investor.
And I guess this is true to a greater or lesser extent of kind of almost all of the staff at OpenAI who own equity in the company. That they're all at odds with the nonprofit foundation, in the sense that like every dollar they manage to squeeze out of it, they keep for themselves.
Well, that's why when he was ousted and everyone said, "Well, look, all the employees want him back," and I'm like, well, yes, because they all have an interest in the for-profit. And really, it's just the nonprofit board at the nonprofit level. I mean, I don't know. I have to look at the 990. They might have an employee or two, but it's all the employees who were at that nonprofit level initially got moved down to the for-profit. and now have interest through the holding company. So there's not a lot of people standing up for that nonprofit.
Yeah, it requires a heroic effort, as you've said.
Yes, that's what we said. It's a heroic effort.
And so in terms of like establishing that this has truly happened at arm's length, I would think that you would have to, Altman would have to have nothing to do with it. He would have to like not be part of the conversation almost at all. He certainly couldn't propose it because he's completely conflicted. And like all of the valuation would have to be done by lawyers and banks that have a total fiduciary obligation to the nonprofit only and not to the for-profit in any way. And I guess you'd even have to find out, are any of the other people on the board conflicted through some sort of financial relationships that they have, or conceivably even personal relationships where pressure might be applied to them. And I mean, it also struck me. You pointed out earlier that the for-profit has taken $6.6 billion in investment from companies that all has to be given back if this conversion to a for-profit doesn't happen within 2 years. I feel like this is, it's like holding hostage the business basically and saying, if you don't do what we want, then we're going to like hold a gun to your head. Like, how can this be at arm's length? It feels so crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only people not conflicted are the nonprofit board members who really don't have any interest in the for-profit activities of OpenAI. Sam Altman can present his case, but he can't be involved in discussion and the eventual vote of the board. The vote of the board will be required to approve this.
Does it require, is it just a simple majority or supermajority or unanimity?
We'd have to look at the bylaws. I think it's probably, unless someone had the foresight to make it a supermajority.
It's probably just a majority.
Yeah. So it would have to be a majority board of the ones who don't have any conflicts of interest.
Right.
Which I think the new ones don't have a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Not a
people
direct
like Larry
conflict
Summers,
of
I think,
interest.
have deliberately chosen with this in mind.
Correct.
And I think there's an ML researcher on there. There's someone from the national security. So these are kind of people who they're the people I'm putting my faith in, that they've got to kind of stick up for the interests of this organization, because they've kind of been put on there, I think, because they don't have any direct relationship. And the hope is that they can stick up for it. It's just, they have to be heroes.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was an assumption when the former ones were ousted and the new ones came in that these were chosen because they were friendlier to Sam Altman, but hopefully friendlier doesn't mean that they don't exercise independent judgment about what's best for the nonprofit.
Yeah. Would you have any other advice for the folks on the board? I mean, I really do think that we should assume good faith and that they're trying to do their absolute, that they're trying to do their best. So I guess what would you tell them if they called you in to give them advice other than what you've said already?
Oh, really just to remember their fiduciary duties and despite what the public might or the investors might want to see, that they really think through what's best for the nonprofit and what's best for that purpose. And remember that you are really giving up a lot by stepping out of the control position. And even though that's irreplaceable, that they should make sure that sufficient compensation goes to the nonprofit, to pay them back for that. And then hopefully that they figure out how the nonprofit best serves the community once it's jettisoned from its controlling position here. Because there's options there. And I don't know what the best option is for how they prioritize what they do.
Yeah, that's a whole other aspect of this that I guess we'll end up coming to at some future time.
I mean, maybe potentially, Rob, with the size of endowment that they get, maybe they can have impact that's different from the other organizations that exist now that are watchdogs. I don't know how well-funded those organizations are.
Yeah, an argument that I can make on the other side is, well, in the past, we haven't really known what to fund. It's all seemed quite speculative, a bit all pie in the sky. But now there are kind of concrete projects that have huge compute requirements, that have huge infrastructure requirements. Like, some of the technical safety research just is getting quite expensive in absolute terms, because we're talking tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions of budget just to have all of the hardware that you need in order to do it. So that's a way that you might be able to deploy serious resources. If you had it as cash rather than equity, that really could push forward the field, could push forward the science in a useful way. That's an opportunity that they have that people didn't have so clearly 5 years ago.
Rob, I don't know where this goes, but what if they decided that one of the other for-profit organizations, let's say the one that Ilya has gone off and started, is in a better position to develop AGI safely? I suppose they could put their money behind that if they had cash. I mean, I hadn't thought of that till now, but they could, if they really were independent, they could decide which horse to back in this race.
Yeah, and choose a different horse if they wanted to.
And choose a different horse, potentially.
Yeah. It's totally true, yeah.
Right?
I mean, and they could choose to invest in it on a for-profit basis as well, right?
Right.
They could try to influence things that way. I mean, I think probably being realistic, that probably won't happen. I mean, that's one reason why, I hope that this doesn't happen, but you could imagine them being quite conservative, that given their position and the scrutiny they're under, they might not be willing to fund more speculative, like hits-based giving, stuff that could backfire or make them look bad, funding people with really, with the kind of cutting-edge ideas that people don't agree with early on. It's going to be tricky for, I guess, a foundation with that kind of public exposure to do that. And that's unfortunate, because I think that's very often where just as, investing in OpenAI early, that was a crazy idea, but that turned out to be massive. It's the high risk giving that usually ends up mattering the most in the end. And so I hope that they don't become too conservative.
Now, knowing more probably about this industry than I do, the actual operations of it, when do you think they'll start turning a profit?
Oh, OpenAI? Well, I think probably not for a very long time, because they will just want to keep reinvesting all of the profits in more compute. That would be my guess.
Like if distributions to OpenAI depended on the nonprofit depended on that, when would that happen?
I mean, I guess within the OpenAI worldview, they're expecting, I think most of the staff are expecting economic growth to really pick up. So we're used to 2 or 3% economic growth, and they're expecting that economic growth could hit 10, 20, 30% more than that as a result of automation of the economy through artificial general intelligence. So you could see an enormous kind of just economic growth in general, people will become way richer, at least if things go well, that's the vision. But there would presumably be just a lot of demand for building more computational infrastructure, building more robots, building more factories to construct all of these things. Their appetite for further investment and for further revenue to fund their growth could be very large. So in terms of the number of years, I'm not sure, but in terms of how much different the world might be until they actually start paying dividends to shareholders, I think their picture would be that it would be a very different world that would be in.
Mm-hmm. So really hard to guess at that, right? Which goes back to your point of even though it might be hard, that they might want to insist on some upfront cash.
Or at least the right to sell it at a reasonable pace. You don't want it all to be locked up. Maybe you want to be able to sell 10% of it every year, basically.
Oh, okay. Right. Because they get their shares and then they can, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because if you were dispersing 10% every year, I mean, I think that's about as much as they could probably sensibly disperse anyway. And so that seems like a reasonable pace to go at, in my mind. I mean, I suppose some people who think that what really matters is the next 3 years, they would argue, no, you've got to spend it all almost immediately, because some people believe that the world's going to be transformed in 3 years' time. 2028 could be the year that we develop much smarter than human intelligence, and it upends so much. But I think you'd want to be diversified across different scenarios, and sort of 10% every year is maybe a reasonable middle ground.
Mm-hmm. What's your personal view of how much risk there is with development of AGI?
Yeah, it depends on the day, depends on what side of the bed I got up in the morning. I mean, I think there's more than 10% chance that we end up going extinct, basically, one way or another. I guess, yeah, maybe that's
Maybe we don't want to end there.
No, yeah, we don't want to end there. No. I mean, hopefully we can go a couple more minutes. Yeah. But I do also by the bull case, I do also think that there's a greater chance that things go incredibly well, and that we get to live through a renaissance of brilliant technology being invented and the economy growing and lots of things being automated, like drudge work that we previously had to do, and lots of wonders coming up. We just have to skate past. Maybe we can talk about this. I could send you some links, but we've got to skate past all of these risks that are created by the big revolutionary changes that come with such an important technology. And if we can get past all of those hurdles, then we get to enjoy the fruits of our labor. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe just a final question is, if things go poorly, so I guess you think that the baseline scenario is that the for-profit, the non-profit, and the California Attorney General will negotiate something that they all think is acceptable, and that kind of has gotten a legal acceptance, and then they'll go ahead with that. And I guess that's good, because you got 2 of the 3 groups in the room will have an interest in the non-profit or in the charitable purpose. I guess if it doesn't go down that path, what do you think is the chance that it could end up being reversed, or what would be the remedy if the courts thought that this had been an unacceptable process in some way?
I mean, I think it's all still going to come down to compensation. So if they got sued for not being fair to the nonprofit, I think the courts would redo the valuation process, the analysis, and say you need to give this much more. That you weren't fair here. I can't see them really saying you must stay with this structure.
Because it's just like the courts imposing themselves, it's like, I guess it would require a court to think that it knows best how to pursue the nonprofit's mission better than the board members do, which I guess is a high bar. They're not going to really feel like they're in a position to do that.
Yeah, it's not such a clear violation of fiduciary duty. If you might question their analysis, but I think they're in a tough enough position that you can't just say you can't restructure.
That makes sense. Okay, so they would go back and redo the valuation and basically demand that they receive more. That makes sense.
So.
And the most likely way, I suppose, that would happen is that the California Attorney General isn't pleased with how things went, and then they take it to court and they say no, we got to do more.
Yes. And they say we're gonna, yeah, or they're just gonna say we don't approve, and then maybe OpenAI has to sue in order to.
So do they have to approve it?
They do have to approve it. Yeah, they do have to approve it because you're required to give notice of conversion from a public benefit corporation to either a mutual benefit, which is another type of nonprofit, or to a for-profit. You also have to give notice when you have a significant transaction affecting a significant amount of your assets. So
I didn't realize that they had to affirmatively support it.
You actually have to give notice. I mean, and they've already gotten ahead of it because they're in conversations with the AG, which is the smart thing to do. I mean, that's definitely, we're all talking about courts and stuff, but I mean, in reality, if you have good counsel, they will try to settle things.
It'll all be sorted out ahead of time.
Yeah.
It should never get to that point. Yeah.
It should not get to that point. Yeah.
You know a bit about, I don't know who the California Attorney General is. I guess I know who it was many years ago, but...
It's Rob Bontas.
Okay, yeah.
Another Rob.
What should I think of Rob Bontas?
Well, he has said that he will protect the public's interest in charitable assets. That's where we think the action will likely be. It was interesting to see Delaware weigh in, though, because they're known as pretty hands-off regulators. But I think this is big enough, that they've decided that they want to look at it too.
Remind me what they said.
They just asked, they issued a list of questions, inquiries, and OpenAI just said they would comply. So they just, I think, issued them a list of questions, maybe including things we've talked about.
I guess I'm coming away from this conversation feeling a little bit more optimistic. I suppose I've tried to paint the picture of how this could be very difficult and how it's a very interesting and exciting thing to watch. But fingers crossed, people step up and do their jobs, and actually we end up with a pretty good outcome in the end.
Yes. I think I definitely think that's our hope now. I mean, I think from the time we first wrote the article, when we thought, is anyone going to look at this? Because initially it was sort of like, who are these people? Why are they ousting Sam Altman? What do they know about AI? And, who are they to think that they can, do this? And we're like, wait, there's the nonprofit board. They have a specific purpose. And the reason they're not involved is very intentional.
Yeah.
So I think from that point to now, there's definitely been progress and attention to the fact that there's a reason that nonprofit was established in the first place, and the fact that it started it all.
Yeah. That's something that most people were missing. Most journalists were missing, for sure.
Yes. It's like it all started with a nonprofit, so it needs to be taken care of. But hopefully they figure out how to remain relevant. I love that word that you use, that they remain, front and center in terms of protecting the development of AI. But the optimistic way to look at it is maybe they can look at it more globally.
Yeah.
And they'll have probably more than most of the organizations trying to protect humanity have.
Yeah, for sure.
Right?
For sure.
They'll have a much bigger checkbook.
Absolutely. Yeah, fingers crossed.
We can there. That's the most optimistic ending I can come up with.
Brilliant. I really appreciate you and your colleagues like drawing attention to this early on. You were on the ball and you saw something important when I think a lot of people were missing it. Depending on how things go, maybe we can check in and see whether the optimistic story has panned out in a year or two.
Yes, sounds good. Thanks so much for inviting me on here.
It's been so much fun. Thanks for joining.
All right. The 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris. Video editing by Simon Monsua. Audio engineering by Simon Monsua, Ben Fordell, and Marla Maguire, and Dominic Armstrong. Full transcripts and extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together, as always, by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.